This is Joe narrating a PowerPoint in the Kaplan book, page 522, Lesson 8 in Life Science about the organization of ecosystems. An ecosystem is an area consisting of a community of organisms. Here you have a deer, frogs, fish, turtles, plants of different types, and the physical environment in which they live. For example, whether on land, in air, in water, and all the climate involved in that area. So that is an ecosystem. This happens to be a pond ecosystem, but there are desert ecosystems, there are urban ecosystems in cities, for example, and they all have their characteristic plants and animal life. This is an actual structure built in the Southwest. It's an artificial biosphere, meaning within these buildings, humans lived with different animals, different plants, and everything was self-contained, so that the plants gave off oxygen, the animals breathed in the oxygen, gave off carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide was then used by the plants to further their growth. So these self-contained systems were an attempt to mimic an isolated ecosystem. For example, to move these structures to another planet that had no atmosphere, you can create a livable ecosystem on these other planets. But you can imagine the whole Earth as an ecosystem, isolated by the vacuum of space and the cold of space, so that everything on Earth lives in a cycle with other things on Earth. Again, the plants giving off oxygen, and the animals breathing in carbon dioxide, breathing in oxygen and giving off carbon dioxide that the plants use. So a key principle in ecosystems is that energy flows through an ecosystem. For example, the sun is the ultimate source of energy in an ecosystem. The sun is used by plants to make food for themselves. These producers are then eaten by other organisms, which are called consumers. These consumers and the producers die off and are degraded by organisms called decomposers into their basic molecules that then go back into the matter pool to be used by the producers again. So, for example, one producer might be a tomato plant. A consumer might be a human that eats a tomato, and a decomposer might be lichen or fungi that decompose the material left at the time of the death of the human and recycles those materials that made up that human into the nutrient pool for other organisms to use. Ultimately, all the energy in the ecosystem is given off as heat, which is a type of energy that is not very usable in ecosystems. So this is a typical food web where animals are connected in these ecosystems by some animals eat others or eat plants, and then those animals are eaten. For example, down the lower left you see the berries that are eaten by green flies and butterflies and grasshoppers, and then these insects are eaten by frogs and birds, and then these animals are eaten by larger animals like buzzards and foxes. So it goes from the producers to the consumers, and when any of these organisms die off, their bodies will be degraded by the decomposers. So we said that energy flows through a system, and matter, what things are made of, cycles through systems. For example, most living organisms are made predominantly of water. This water, for example, in the ocean, it evaporates, or it goes from a liquid to a gas, and in the atmosphere, these gaseous water molecules can condense together to form a cloud. These clouds, if over land, will then rain, and the water will come out of the air back onto the land into lakes, rivers, and underground water storage. This water will be used by organisms on the land to create bulk in their tissues. Just as for water, one of the basic building blocks of all living things is carbon. This carbon originally comes from volcanoes and nowadays from burning fossil fuels. But this carbon dioxide is given off into the atmosphere. Plants take in the carbon dioxide to make up their own tissues and give off oxygen as a waste product. This carbon in the plants is then ingested by animals that eat plants, and it becomes part of their tissues. When these plants and animals die, the decomposers convert the carbon within the plants and animals into carbon dioxide again. Also for nitrogen. Nitrogen is an essential nutrient for plants and animals. Our atmosphere is about 80% nitrogen, but it can't be used by plants without being altered by the bacteria in the soil. So the bacteria in the soil convert the nitrogen into the air into a usable form of nitrogen called a nitrate, which is then taken up by the plant and becomes part of the plant tissues, which are then eaten by consumers. And so matter such as water, carbon, and nitrogen goes through a cycle within living organisms and then outside of living organisms, whereas energy flows through a system, changing in form from one form to another, but still always being there. That's it for page 522, Organizations of Ecosystems.